Hey guys, Sean here. Today I'll be profiling my new and improved Ancient Gear deck. Ancient Gear's my favorite deck of all time. It's just the best deck in the game. We have yet to get new support with cards like Statue, so this is my build pre-Statue. Also pre like Clockwork Knight, which is a new card coming out next year. I will be making updated profiles when those cards come out, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But without further ado, let's get into my December 2024 Ancient Gear deck profile. First up, 3 copies of your Ancient Gear Wyvern, your main starter of the deck, your Stratos. So on summon, this searches you any Ancient Gear card, which is essential for your combos. It's a level 4, so it helps you go into some of your important XZs. But keep in mind when you use this effect, you cannot set for the rest of the turn. The main issue with Ancient Gear is really that you can't set cards, so going first is like a big issue. You can't really set floodgates or any kind of like interruptions. So keep that in mind, this is definitely a blind going second deck, but we definitely max out Wyvern, one of the best cards in the deck, one of your best combo starters for the deck. Next up, 1 copy of your Ancient Gear Frame, essentially another Wyvern. You can discard a card to search Ancient Gear Golem or any spell trap that mentions Ancient Gear Golem, so it's basically a combo starter for the cost of a discard. It can be helpful if you need to use Wyvern and Frame to search, so you can search 2 specific cards. Not the most important card in the deck, but we definitely run the 1 copy. It can come up. It at least is a combo starter, which is helpful, so 1 copy I do like to run. Next up, 2 copies of your Ancient Gear Tanker. You can run this at 1, you only need 1 for the combo, but I think it's really important because if you have it in your opening hand, it can be a really good way to play into Disruption. Its effect is, when it's normally special summoned, you can special summon an Ancient Gear monster from your hand, or if your opponent controls a monster, you can special summon an Ancient Gear monster from your graveyard, ignoring summoning conditions. So it's a really important card for the deck, really good extender. You can even bring back your fusions, which is insane, because it ignores summoning conditions. It can bring back your Chaos Ancient Gear Giant. So if your opponent outs some of your really big monsters before the battle phase, and you still have your normal summon, you can normal summon Tanker, bring it back, and attack for game. It has another effect where you can target a card you control and destroy it, and then all monsters that mention Ancient Gear Golem gain 600 attack, which not only helps you with OTKing because it boosts up all your monsters, but it can also pop cards like Geartown, which can trigger their effects that way. So really good, it's a great extender and a great part of your combo. 2 copies is good in my opinion, but you can definitely run it at 1 if you want. Next up, 1 Ancient Gear Commander. We only really run this card because we need it engraved to use our Ancient Gear Duel. We don't run the original Ancient Gear Golem in this deck, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that means that the first effect of this card is pretty much pointless. The main effect of this card is that when it's in the graveyard, you can banish it to activate an Ancient Gear Trap directly from your hand, which is one of the main ways we OTK because it lets us go into Ultimate Ancient Gear Golem and enables it to attack 3 times. So very important for the deck. Most of the times it is a brick, so you don't want to see it in your opening hand, but an essential piece to the deck. And finally, for the Ancient Gear monsters, 2 copies of your Ancient Gear Dark Golem. Pretty much replaces the original Ancient Gear Golem in the deck. On summon, you can add up to 2 Ancient Gear and or Geartown cards from your deck to your hand, and then you discard 1 card. So insane to just be able to search 2 cards for free basically. The discard doesn't really matter, and sometimes it can even help your plays because a lot of cards we have in the deck do benefit from being in the grave. Its name counts as Ancient Gear Golem while on the field, so that's important for cards like your Ancient Gear Fusion and a lot of your other cards in the deck that need you to control the original Ancient Gear Golem. It's a 3k body, and when it attacks, your opponent cannot activate spells and traps until the end of the damage step. So a vital part of the combo, it can be special summoned unlike the original Ancient Gear Golem, so you can use cards like Geartown to summon this directly from deck. Just keep in mind, if this card is negated, it won't count as Ancient Gear Golem anymore, so you won't be able to use Ancient Gear Fusion to fuse from deck, which is one of the downsides of running the retrain, but there's really no point in running the original Ancient Gear Golem. It only really helps with your turn 1 combos, and our turn 1 combos are just so bad anyway, we're not really going to benefit from running it. I don't run any of the rank 8s in this deck, so there is really no place for Ancient Gear Golem, maybe for certain builds, but for this build, we're really focusing on going second, so all we need is 2 Ancient Gear Dark Golem. Next up, we have 1 copy of Gizmek Taniguku. This is an urgent schedule target. Basically, when it's in the graveyard, you can banish it to special summon an Earth Machine with the same attack and defense from your graveyard. Our 2 targets in this deck are Ancient Gear Dark Golem, who has 3k attack and defense, and your Ancient Gear Tanker, who has 1300 attack and defense. You can just special summon them from the graveyard using your Gizmek. Really good off urgent schedule. You can summon Dark Golem off of urgent schedule alongside your Taniguku, and then you can link them off into Ballista, and then use your Taniguku Engrave to just special summon back your Dark Golem. Fantastic combo. It's a brick worth running in my opinion. You don't have to run it, but I think it's really, really good. For the final monster, we have 3 Jizukiru. There was no other way to pronounce that name.
1 copy of Jizukiru, the Star Destroying Kaiju.
And it is basically a Kaiju. It's a machine, so it can attack under urgent schedule. But for the most part, you're just using this as a board breaker. Very good Kaiju. Unfortunately, there's no Earth Machine Kaijus. That would just be too broken apparently in Ancient Gears. But it's just a Kaiju, just a board breaker. You don't have to run it if you don't want to. You can replace this with any board breaker. But being able to remove your opponent's monster while keeping a monster on their field is very important for your Ancient Gear card effects. It keeps Urgent Schedule alive, and it keeps a lot of your Ancient Gear card effects alive. So definitely consider running a Kaiju. I think it's really, really good. Next up onto the spells now, we have 3 copies of Ancient Gear Advance. You're pretty much your best combo starter in the deck because it doesn't require your normal summon. On activation, you'll add any Ancient Gear spell trap from your deck to your hand. However, the turn you activate this card, you cannot set cards on the field. So this makes it so that you're pretty much locked into going second. If you activate this card, you can't set like an Imperm or anything like that. You can't set spells or traps. You can't even use cards like Book of Eclipse because that technically does set monsters. So that is a limitation, but it's not too big of a deal. It only really impacts us if we're going first, but most of the time we don't want to go first anyway. Your main target you'll be searching off this is your Ancient Gear Catapult, because Catapult's able to pop this to special summon any monster from the deck. It has another effect where you can tribute a monster you control to draw a card, which is fantastic because not only are you drawing more cards, you're freeing up your monster zones so that you're actually able to use cards like Catapult, which need you to have no monsters on field. So definitely the best card in the deck. It can even search Fortress, which is insane. If you already have the Catapult in hand, you can use this to search Fortress and your opponent cannot interrupt your plays any further. So definitely the best combo starter in the deck. We definitely max this out. Next up, 2 copies of your Ancient Gear Catapult. You can definitely run this at 1. However, if you're going first, you're going to be using this for your combo. And to win on the crackback, you really want the second copy. You always want to see this card in your hand as well. If you're able to use your advanced search on something else, that's really good. I did cut Ancient Gear Golem, the original, for the second copy of Catapult. But obviously you can change that however you like. You can even cut 1 Catapult for any other board breaker or any really good card. But I think 2 Catapults are really good. What it does is that if you control no monsters, you can target a face-up spell trap you control, destroy it, and then special summon any Ancient Gear monster from your deck, ignoring summoning conditions. So this is a great way of getting into any one of your Ancient Gear cards. The ignoring summoning conditions part doesn't matter anymore because we're not running the OG Golem, but if you are running the OG Golem, this can summon it straight from the deck, which is really, really good. It's really good in combination with Geartown because you'll be able to special summon a monster off of Catapult, and then it will trigger Geartown, which will special summon another monster from your deck. And it has another effect in Grave where you can banish it to target a card you control, destroy it, and special summon into your token, which is really helpful in being able to destroy stuff like a Geartown, special out a token, and the token can be used as link material to go into something like your Ballista, or even as fusion material to go into something like your Chaos Integer Giant. So fantastic card in the deck. I think 2 copies is just fine, but 1 copy can definitely work. Next up, 1 copy of Geartown. I can see you upping Geartown specifically because Ballista can search it, and your Dark Golem can search it, and it's not once per turn, so you can definitely like trigger this card twice on a turn. So maybe if you even want to run 2 Geartown and 1 Catapult, that might be an option as well. Its on-field effect is that you can normal summon into your monsters for 1 less tribute. Doesn't really come up. The main effect is that when it's destroyed, you can special summon into your monster from your hand, deck, or grave. Fantastic, not once per turn, it's just really, really good. The only issue is that this card can miss timing. This card needs to be destroyed on Chainlink 1, otherwise it will miss timing, so that really, really sucks. But most of the time it's not really an issue, just keep that in mind that it can miss timing. It's also not an Ancient Gear card, so you can't search it off of something like Wyvern, and it's not protected by your Ancient Gear Fortress, so keep that in mind, but you at least run 1 copy for the combo. Next up, probably the best card in the deck, we have triple Ancient Gear Fortress, newly reprinted, thank God, because this card was a very expensive common. It's a continuous spell that says your opponent cannot respond to the activation of your Ancient Gear cards or effects, and during the turn they were summoned, your Ancient Gear cards cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So an insanely good card in the deck, so it gives your whole turn protection pretty much. You always want to see this in your opening hand, you can search it, which is fantastic. This card can even play around Duel if you activate Fortress and then you do your combo. As long as your chains keep leading into new chains, your opponent won't be able to respond to any of it, so you're able to search multiple cards without getting Dueled, which is fantastic. Obviously you can't get Ashed if you're using effects under Fortress, can't get Impermed because your monsters can't be targeted. It's such a fantastic card in the deck. It's also not once per turn, so if your opponent has a way to out one of them, you can just activate another one straight away. And it has a really good bonus effect which can come up where if it's destroyed, you can special summon an Integer monster from your hand or grave, but then you can't special summon any other monsters for the rest of the turn, except for Ancient Gear monsters. Keep that in mind, that is a big restriction because we have a lot of cards in the extra deck that are not Ancient Gear monsters. But for the most part, if you use this correctly, this is the best card in the deck. Pretty much Sanguine Summoning on crack because it's just that good. So we 100% max this out, the best card in the deck. And for the final Ancient Gear spell, we have 1 copy of Ancient Gear Fusion. Again, you can run this at 2 if you want, but 1 copy is more than enough. It is the Ancient Gear Fusion spell of the deck. However, if you control Ancient Gear Golem, or your Dark Golem because it counts as Ancient Gear Golem along the field, you can use fusion material from your deck to fusion summon an Ancient Gear monster, which is just fantastic. Your Ancient Gear monsters require a lot of material, so it's really good to just be able to dump stuff from deck instead. Chaos Giant needs 4 monsters, so being able to use that from the deck is really handy. And you can even use this to dump certain cards that you want to get back off of your tanker, which is a really cool combo. You can dump something like a Wyvern, normal summon tanker, bring back out the Wyvern and search that way. And you can even send something like your Ancient Gear Commander, and now that it's in grave, it can actually banish itself to activate your Ancient Gear Duel. So really strong card. It's also not once per turn, which is why you might want to run it at 2. But 1 copy, more than enough for your combos. Very easily searchable. Just a fantastic card. Triple Urgent Schedule. It is a quick play spell that says if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can special summon 1 level 4 or lower Earth Machine and 1 level 5 or higher Earth Machine from your deck, but negate their effects. So just free 2 bodies on the field, which is absolutely insane. Even though their effects are negated, you can still use them to just link into something like a Ballista or any link monster. Really good at getting at your Dark Golem and something like your Gizmek Taniguku, so that you can just link them off and then do that combo I talked about before. It's a quick play as well, which comes up. It's just really good, but it does require your opponent to have a monster, so this is a dead card if your opponent ends on no cards. So definitely one of the best cards in the deck. I would definitely not run this deck without this card. Next up, we have Way Where There's a Will, which is a new field spell that essentially acts as a pot of prosperity. During your main phase, you can excavate the top number of cards from your deck up to the number of cards your opponent controls. Then you can add 1 to your hand, and then you shuffle the remaining cards excavated and 1 card from your hand into the bottom of your deck in any order. So essentially, pot of prosperity, but it won't halve your attack, which is really important. Another good card to run at 2. It's not really searchable, we don't run terraforming, but it is a really good card in the deck. And it has a really weird effect, which will not come up often, but if you've excavated 9 cards from this card's effect, you can shuffle all cards your opponent controls and in your graveyard into the deck. This will pretty much never come up, but it's very funny. If your opponent has an insane board, it's maybe possible to activate this and just wipe the board completely. So keep that in mind, I guess. Might catch your opponent off guard, but the excavation effect is just really good. So I like the 1 copy of this card. Finally, onto all the board breakers. We run a lot. Triple Forbidden Droplet, which is definitely your best board breaker in the deck. It's a quick play where you can send cards from your field or hand to the graveyard to negate that many monsters on the field and half their attack. It doesn't target, so it plays around a lot of different cards. It's a quick play, so it's really good. You can even activate cards like maybe your Catapult, even a Lightning Storm, and then chain your Forbidden Droplet, send that card you were activating before, and then you can negate more cards more efficiently, which is just fantastic. It's just so good. And the best part of this card is that your opponent cannot respond with cards that are the same type that you sent. So if you send a trap, your opponent cannot respond with traps. If you send a monster or a spell, your opponent cannot respond with them. It's just really good. And because it changes a monster's attack, it can even be activated during the damage step. So it's very good against decks like Tenpai. We definitely run this card. It's just fantastic. But keep in mind, you can't activate this card under Shifter or any effects that make sure your cards get banished instead of going to grave. And keep in mind that you have to negate as many cards as you send. If you send maybe like 2 cards and your opponent removes 1 monster from field, the effect will fizzle because it can't negate as many cards as you sent. So you won't even be able to negate 1 card. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it might just be better to negate less cards. Next up, 2 copies of your Lightning Storm and 1 copy of your Harpies. Pretty much your back row removal of the deck. Of course, Lightning Storm can also be used to destroy attack position monsters, but most of the time this is just for back row. The problem with destroying all attack position monsters is that if our opponent has no monsters on field, we can't activate a lot of our effects. So keep that in mind. For the most part, this is just back row removal. And again, really great in combination with Droplet, because you can activate Lightning Storm to remove all your opponent's back row, and then chain Droplet, sending Lightning Storm to negate a card. So it's really nice to be able to have main deck back row removal, so definitely run these cards. Next up, 3 copies of Ultimate Slayer, a very strong card in this deck, but a little bit tricky to use. So what this card does is that your opponent can activate monster effects in response to this card's activation. You can target an extra deck monster your opponent controls. send from your extra deck one monster of the same type, so Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link, and then you shuffle your opponent's card back into their deck. So a really good form of removal. Obviously shuffling a card into the deck is fantastic, your opponent not being able to respond is really good, and we can also send certain cards from our extra deck to the grave in order to gain additional effects. We run a lot of really good targets which we'll get into soon, but this card is not just a bounce, we can also use it to dump something like an Entis, to pop more cards, to dump a Garura, to draw cards. It's just fantastic. We'll get into the targets soon, but 3 copies of this card is just fantastic. For the final board breaker, a new card from the Infinite Forbidden, we have 3 copies of Final Bringer of the End Times, which is a really cool card. It's a quick play where you target one monster you control and one card your opponent controls, and you destroy both. We can use this card to destroy cards our opponent controls, but we can also use this card to dodge certain cards like an Imperm or an Effect Failure. We can use this card to dodge any targeted negation, which is really good, and it doesn't have to destroy your own monster to destroy your opponent's card. As long as it can destroy one card, it will destroy it. So even if you want to use this card to destroy something like a Wyvern, and then use Forbidden Droplet to send this card and the Wyvern to grave, you'll be able to negate 2 cards off of the Droplet, and then also pop the card off of your End Times. So just a really good card in the deck. Can be a great way to get rid of some back row. You can definitely replace this with whatever board breaker you like. I do think that the Mulcharmies are fantastic in this deck, but obviously the Mulcharmies are very expensive and not for budget players, so I think this is a really cool option for the deck. We're going full on board breaker, and I think this is a fantastic board breaker to run. And finally, we have 1 copy of Jizukiru Duel, the 1 trap card in the deck. The only way we use this is that we activate it from our hand using our commander. What it does is that it makes our Jizukiru Golems and our monsters that mention them unaffected by monster effects. And if our opponent controls a monster, and if we control Jizukiru Golem, we can fusion summon into a monster that mentions Jizukiru Golem as material by banishing monsters from our field or grave. And that monster can attack 3 times. So we use this to go into our ultimate Jizukiru Golem, which will be able to attack 3 times, which is just fantastic. Obviously it's a continuous trap, so we can use it during the battle phase as well. We can attack in with something like our Dark Golem, kill a monster, and then use Duel to fusion summon into our ultimate Jizukiru Golem and attack even more. So really fantastic card in the deck. It is a bit of a brick, but it's just fantastic. A great way to win duels, so we definitely run this card in the deck. That's it for the main deck. We'll go on to the extra deck now. For the fusions, we have 1 Chaos Integer Giant, 1 Ultimate Integer Golem, and 1 Integer Howitzer. So Chaos Giant is most of the times our best fusion monster. Needs 4 Ancient Gear monsters to summon it, so that's why it's really important that we can send cards from grave with our Ancient Gear fusion. He is unaffected by spells and traps. He can attack all monster your opponent controls. He's 4500 attack. He does piercing, and during the battle phase your opponent cannot activate monster effects. So just a fantastic card. If you make it to battle phase with this card and your opponent has enough monsters on field, you pretty much always win the duel. Really good against Tenpai because it stops your opponent from activating stuff during the battle phase. So even if you're going first, this is a great thing to end on, because unless your opponent has some good removal, they won't be able to break this, and you pretty much win the duel from there. If your opponent only has maybe 1 monster on field, or if they have no monsters on field, Ultimate Integer Golem is your best bet. 4400 attack, does piercing, your opponent can't activate spells or traps during the damage step, and if you summon this off your Ancient Gear Duel, you're able to attack 3 times. In combination with your Tanker, which will give this a 600 attack point boost, you'll be able to attack 3 times for 5k each. Even more, if you boost this up with Dugaris, you can boost this up to 10k attack, and pretty much your opponent's not surviving this. And finally, Ancient Gear Howitzer just needs 2 Ancient Gear monsters, unaffected by other card effects, so it's a mini towers. During the main phase, you can burn your opponent for 1000, so that might come up for finishing off your opponent. And when it's destroyed, you can special summon an Ancient Gear monster from your deck, ignoring summoning conditions. So a really annoying card for your opponent to play through. It can be pretty decent going first because it's unaffected by everything, and it brings out bodies from the deck once it's destroyed. So what you can do is you can leave this in defense. If your opponent destroys it, you can special summon Ancient Gear Tanker from your graveyard, and Tanker can bring back your Ancient Gear Howitzer to help you survive the turn. And Howitzer is not once per turn, so Howitzer will be able to special summon another monster, and you might just live the turn. These are the only Ancient Gear fusions we run. I don't think Megaton Golem is good. It's a bit more generic to summon, but I really just don't think it's a good card in this deck. It just doesn't have enough attack, and pretty much any time you could go into it, you could just go into something like a Chaos Giant or an Ultimate Ancient Gear Golem instead. You can consider it, but extra deck space is very tight because we're running a lot of Ultimate Slayer targets, so these 3 monsters here are all you really need. Next up, we have some targets for Ultimate Slayer. We have 1 copy of Entis and 1 copy of Garura. So if your opponent controls a fusion monster and you use Ultimate Slayer, you can send either one of these to the grave. Ultimate Slayer will bounce the monster, and these guys will trigger. Entis can target a card on the field and destroy it, and Garura can draw you a card. So just fantastic to be able to plus off of your Ultimate Slayer. You can only use Entis if you send it off of Ultimate Slayer when they have a fusion monster, but with Garura, if they have a link monster, you can send your Tri-Brigade Link 5, which we run in the deck, which can then dump the Garura, which can draw you a card. So very important targets for your Ultimate Slayer. Next up, one synchro, we have Malong. Basically the same thing as your Entis. If it's sent to grave, you can target a card in the field and return it to the hand. Pretty much, if your opponent has a strong synchro monster, use Ultimate Slayer, send this, get rid of the synchro monster, and then this can bounce a card. Next up, a card you'll be seeing a lot of this format, we have Aggregator. You'll use this for your Ultimate Slayer if your opponent has an Xyz monster, and if this card is sent to grave, you can target a card in the field and negate its effects for the rest of the turn. So really good to just be able to negate any card on the field. You'll be seeing this a lot in decks like Raziel, so you're definitely going to get used to this card, but we can use it to great effect, especially against Raziel, so one copy is very nice. We do have more generic Xyz. We have one Dugaris and one Babuska. They're both generic rank 4s, just need 2 level 4 monsters, which most of our main deck Ancient Gear monsters are. The main effect of Dugaris is that you can detach the material, target one monster you control, and double its attack. So of course, great for going for game. It can also target a monster in the graveyard and special summon it, and it can also draw you 2 cards and discard 1. These effects can come up, but most of the time you're just going to be doubling one of your monster's attacks. And good old Baguska, it is your main turn 1 play. You end on this, and you just hope and pray that you live the turn. So while it's on the field in defense position, your opponent's monsters are turned to defense, and your opponent can activate the effects of defense position monsters. It doesn't stop links, so your opponent's links will still be able to use their effects, but also your links will still be able to use their effects. So keep that in mind, it's very important. But yeah, this is basically your main turn 1 play. This deck is not the best going first, but this is a very good card to have. Finally, for the links, we have 2 copies of your Ancient Gear Ballista. It's a link 2 that just needs 2 Earth Machine monsters. On summon, you can add either a Geartown or an Ancient Gear monster from your deck to your hand, and you can target a spell trap you control and a monster your opponent controls. You destroy your own spell trap, and you put your opponent's monster down to 0 attack and defense. So this is able to weaken your opponent's big monsters so you can beat into them, and it can even pop stuff like Geartown, which can trigger its effect that way. So fantastic card, absolutely essential for the deck. 2 is more than enough, we don't really need more than that. Next up, 1 copy of Cleaforth Genius, another Earth Machine monster we can go into. It is unaffected by spell and trap card effects and the effects of link monsters. It can target 2 cards on the field, 1 card you control and 1 card your opponent controls, and negate their effects. So really good at negating like continuous cards in the field or any kind of annoying floodgates your opponent has. Really good against decks like Yubel, so you can negate a lot of their annoying cards like Nightmare Pain. Even a Yubel monster, you can negate their effects. Just a really good card. It comes up in certain situations. It's vital for the deck, so definitely run this card at 1. Next up, 1 copy of SP Little Knight. We're not running IP. The extra space is just too tight. It can be difficult to set up IP going first, that's why we just run the SP. SP is definitely not a bad card to end on, but obviously it's great going second. If you summon this using a extra deck monster, you can banish a card on the field or in the graveyard, but then you can't attack directly for the rest of the turn, which can be a bit of an issue, but considering that all of our boss monsters do piercing, most of the times we can circumvent that by just doing piercing and winning that way. Its other effect is that when your opponent activates a card effect, you can target 2 monsters, 1 you control, 1 your opponent controls, and banish them both until the end phase. It can be a great disruption and a great way to play into a board, so SP Little Knight is just fantastic. Next up, 1 copy of Sky Striker Ace Azalea Temperance. It's a link 3 machine monsters that needs 2+ monsters including a link, so we can go into this using something like a Ballista and any other monster. On summon, we can banish a spell from our field or grave, target 1 monster our opponent controls with 2500 or less attack, and equip it to our Azalea Temperance. We run so many spells in the deck, so we can pretty much always use this card. Great for getting rid of our opponent's monsters without sending them to grave. So again, versus Yubel, which is a matchup that this deck really struggles against, you're able to just steal your opponent's Yubel monsters, so it won't trigger any of their effects. So it's just a really good card to run. You can cut it for something else if you want, but I really like it in the deck. I think you should definitely give it a try. The 1 copy is really cool. Next up we have Tri-Brigade Bucephalus. The only reason we run this is as an Ultimate Slayer target. If our opponent has a link monster, we can send this to grave, and this can send our Garura, which can let us draw a card. Pretty much the only purpose, but it's very nice to be able to get rid of our opponent's link monsters and draw a card as well, so the 1 copy is very nice. That's it for the extra deck. We'll go on to the side deck now. For the side deck, it is very tricky because you pretty much want to set yourself up for going first. Going first is very difficult for the deck. So I think you can either run this deck in two different ways. You can go full floodgates, or you can go full kind of hand traps. I kind of went in between. Well, first of all, we do have Ancient Gear Dragon. This card's only good going first. It cannot be special summoned, but you can normal summon it for free if you control an Inert Machine. When your opponent activates a spell or trap, you can send an Inert Machine you control to the grave, or an Ancient Gear Golem from your deck to the grave to negate the effect. Because we don't run Ancient Gear Golem, we're just going to have to send itself to negate a spell trap. But it's a nice end board piece to end on if you're going first. Definitely not worth main decking. You can definitely cut this as well if you want, but I think the one copy is just a nice kind of piece to end on if you're going first. Next up, we have 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird. I think this is pretty good because if we want to run hand traps, we really want to run cards that will stop our opponent's turn completely, and Droll is one of those cards that can have that effect. If your opponent adds a card from deck to hand, you can discard this card to prevent your opponent from adding cards from the deck to the hand for the rest of the turn. So really good at shutting down a lot of decks. A lot of decks really suffer from this card. This can definitely help you live a turn if you're going first, and can allow you to OTK on the following turn. So a hand trap like this I think is really good. In a similar vein, we have Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. It is not the best hand trap, but I think it's pretty good. It stops certain decks. Of course, really good against Tenpai hitting the field spell. A lot of other decks really suffer from this card, but this is definitely one of those cards where you can just run whatever you like. This can even be Shifter if you like, but we have a replacement for Shifter. But you can pretty much run whatever hand traps you want. Next up, 3 copies of your Dimensional Fissure, which is just really good in the deck. Whilst on the field, any monster sent to grave is banished instead. So a really annoying floodgate. The only floodgates this deck can run are continuous spells because we can't set cards when we use our Ancient Gear cards. So cards like Dimensional Fissure are just fantastic in this deck. If we end up surviving our opponent's turn with Dimensional Fissure, we can use cards like Catapult to destroy it, and then we won't have to worry about our cards getting banished. So a really good floodgate in the deck. Of course, you can still run Shifter and stuff like that, but I think Fissure is just a fantastic card for the deck. Next up, triple Messenger of Peace. Again, a continuous spell card floodgate. Very funny against decks like Tenpai because their monsters won't be able to attack. Any monster with 1500 or more attack cannot attack. And during your standby phase, you can pay 100 life points to keep this card in the field, but otherwise you can send it to grave. So this card will pretty much never stop you from attacking because you can always get rid of it whenever you want. But it can be really devastating to decks like Tenpai or decks that want to beat over your monsters because it just prevents them from attacking. So another great card to run in the deck, I really like it. And finally, 2 Cosmic Cyclones, just for back row decks. We already run back row removal in the form of Lightning Storm and Harpies in the main deck, so I think 2 copies is just enough. You can even consider running something like Twin Twisters, because a lot of our cards do get effects when they're destroyed, so Twin Twister might be a nice option in the deck. So definitely consider that, but I think 2 Cosmic Cyclone is just good enough. So that's it for my new and improved Ancient Gear deck profile. I'm pretty happy with this build. Of course, we don't have a lot of really important cards out yet in the TCG, like Statue, but once that card comes out, this deck is going to get such a big power boost. Even cards like Clockwork Knight coming out in January of next year is going to be a big boost for the deck. I think there's going to be some really cool stuff you can do with that card. But for now, I think this is a very solid Ancient Gear deck. I think it's just really good at breaking boards, really good at just doing what the deck does in just OTKing, going for game. And we do have a semi-decent strategy for going first. So yeah, I'm very happy with how the deck turned out. If you have any ideas or suggestions in the comments, let me know. Also, if you want to see a combo guide in this deck, let me know, I'd be happy to make one. If you're interested in building this deck in real life, we do have a TCG player affiliate link in the description, which if you use that, it directly supports the channel and helps us keep up the content. And if you want to support the channel a bit more, we do have memberships, which give you access to our content as soon as we make it. So definitely consider that if you like. But thanks for watching, let me know what you think in the comments, and stay tuned for more Ancient Gear content.